$72 billion left New York in less than 2 years, and the number matters less for its size than for what it signals about confidence, because capital rarely moves without making a judgment first. This was not a single decision or a dramatic overnight collapse, but a steady, rational migration by individuals and firms responding to incentives, costs, and expectations about the future. In political language, that movement has been framed as moral progress by some leaders and as economic decay by their critics. But neither slogan captures the full truth of what is happening. What matters is that money which once circulated through payrolls, pensions, storefront leases, and municipal tax rolls is now circulating somewhere else, and cities live or die by circulation. The question is not whether redistribution or compassion are valid goals, but whether the chosen methods strengthened the social fabric or quietly hollowed it out. When wealth exits a city at that scale, it does not depart as an abstraction, and it does not travel alone. It carries with it employment networks, service contracts, professional ecosystems, and the fragile interdependence that keeps a dense urban economy functioning. The departure of a hedge fund does not only affect traders, just as the closure of a restaurant does not only affect its owner, because every node in a city is connected to several others. To describe that process as purification is to adopt a moral vocabulary for what is, at its core, a mechanical economic reaction. Once moral language replaces feedback, policy stops adjusting to outcomes and begins defending itself against reality. New York's leadership has argued that the loss of high-income residents and firms represents a necessary correction to decades of inequality. That argument assumes that the pain of transition will be temporary and that what replaces the departing capital will be more stable, more just, and more broadly shared. Critics counter that this assumption ignores the role private enterprise has historically played in funding public services, even in cities that pride themselves on progressive values. Both positions contain partial truths, which is why the conflict has become so bitter, because each side believes the other is willfully blind to consequences. In that tension, numbers become weapons rather than diagnostics, and lived experience becomes anecdote rather than evidence. The streets provide their own data, even when no spreadsheet is present. Vacant storefronts, shortened business hours, and the visible thinning of foot traffic are not ideological statements, but symptoms. For residents who remain, higher taxes and fees arrive with the promise of greater equity, yet often without the immediate improvement in services that would justify them. For those who leave, the decision is rarely framed as political rebellion, but as practical arithmetic about housing, schooling, safety, and opportunity. When enough people make that same calculation, the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Migration is not new to America, and interstate competition has always been part of the federal system. States differ in tax structures, regulatory burdens, energy costs, and labor environments, and businesses respond accordingly. What makes this moment distinct is the moral framing applied to that competition, where economic winners and losers are recast as virtuous or corrupt based on ideology rather than performance. That framing hardens positions and discourages compromise because admitting error begins to feel like betraying a cause. As a result, policy debates that should be technical become existential, and adjustments that should be routine become politically radioactive. The contrast between New York and Texas has become a shorthand in this debate, often exaggerated for effect, but rooted in real differences. Texas leaders emphasize predictability, lower taxes, and a business-friendly posture, arguing that growth itself is the engine of social stability. New York leaders emphasize redistribution, regulation, and the corrective role of government arguing that unchecked markets entrench inequality. Neither model is pure, and both rely on public-private interaction to function. Yet the rhetorical divide treats them as moral opposites. That divide sets the stage for the confrontation that follows, because it transforms policy disagreement into a trial of values. As wealth and people moved south and west, the national media began to frame the story as a referendum on progressive governance. Supporters of New York's approach argued that short-term disruption was being misread as failure by impatient critics. Opponents argued that the disruption was not accidental but foreseeable, and therefore indicting. In this environment, every statistic became contested territory, and every anecdote was amplified to serve a narrative. The city itself became a symbol rather than a place where millions still lived, worked, and tried to make sense of daily life. Against this backdrop, Washington entered the story not as an impartial observer, but as an arena where national consequences would be argued. Federal funds, by definition, transform local decisions into national concerns, because they carry the money of taxpayers far beyond one state's borders. When questions arise about how those funds are administered, the issue stops being philosophical and becomes procedural. Process, transparency, and accountability are less glamorous than slogans, but they are the mechanisms that turn ideals into outcomes. It is here that the narrative shifts from decline to scrutiny, from rhetoric to records. The hearing that follows is presented as more than a routine oversight session, because it touches on the legitimacy of governance itself. At stake is not only whether specific transfers were appropriate, but whether public trust has been treated as a renewable resource rather than a finite one. For defenders of New York's leadership, the hearing represents a politically motivated attempt to criminalize progressive policy. For critics, it represents a long-delayed effort to force clarity where language has obscured practice. The room becomes a microcosm of the broader national divide, compressed into a single table under bright lights. What gives the confrontation its intensity is not outrage alone, but the collision of narratives backed by documents, testimony, and interpretation. Allegations are framed carefully, not as verdicts, but as questions about authorization, routing, and intent. Each side claims the mantle of protecting ordinary people, even as they accuse the other of exploitation. This symmetry is unsettling, because it suggests that moral certainty can coexist with factual dispute. The audience is left to watch not for heroes and villains, but for coherence between words and actions. Throughout the exchange, language itself becomes an instrument of power. Terms like equity, redistribution, incentive, and corruption are deployed strategically, each carrying emotional weight beyond their technical meaning. The challenge for any serious analysis is to strip those words back to their operational definitions, because outcomes follow structure, not intention. If funds meant for relief do not reach recipients, the reason matters more than the rhetoric used to justify the system. Likewise, if growth strategies disproportionately benefit the wealthy, the mechanics deserve scrutiny regardless of patriotic branding. This opening does not assume guilt, nor does it assume virtue. It treats the events described as a case study in how modern governance struggles to balance morality, efficiency, and accountability in a polarized environment. The story that follows examines claims, counterclaims, and the evidence presented, while recognizing that political theater often obscures as much as it reveals. It asks whether the economic pain felt in New York was an unintended consequence, an acceptable cost, or a deliberate lever, without presuming the answer in advance. Above all, it insists that citizens deserve explanations grounded in facts rather than faith, because faith without accountability is not policy. It is persuasion. The hearing did not begin with shouting, because real power rarely announces itself that way, and the most consequential confrontations often start with a tone so measured it feels almost courteous. The room was arranged like a familiar ritual of American governance, flags placed with mathematical symmetry, nameplates aligned, cameras positioned to capture faces rather than nuance. Every participant understood that the audience was not only the people in the room, but millions watching fragments later, sliced into clips that would confirm whatever they already believed. That awareness shaped every sentence, every pause, every decision about when to sound conciliatory and when to sound firm. In that environment, truth does not simply emerge, it is negotiated under pressure. Pam Bondi entered the narrative as a figure of procedural certainty rather than ideological fervor. Her posture and cadence communicated that this was not a debate about values but an inquiry into methods, approvals, and trails. For supporters, she represented overdue accountability. For critics, she embodied the weaponization of oversight against political opponents. Both interpretations can coexist because institutions do not operate in a vacuum, and motives are rarely pure. Still, the function of her role was clear: to anchor the discussion to records rather than rhetoric. Across the table, Mayor Zoran Mandani projected a different energy, one grounded in moral confidence and communicative fluency. His public persona was built on the language of justice, inclusion, and historical correction, and he carried that language into the room like a shield. For him, the hearing was not simply about accounting, but about defending a worldview that treats economic disruption as a necessary stage of reform. That worldview assumes that concentrated wealth is inherently destabilizing, and that government must actively reshape the distribution of power. The risk of such an assumption is not that it is malicious, but that it can become insulated from feedback when outcomes disappoint. Governor Kathy Hochul's presence added a layer of institutional continuity to the exchange. She was positioned as both partner and protector, someone who understood the machinery of state governance and the necessity of compromise. Her defense relied on the idea that complex systems cannot be reduced to isolated transactions without distorting intent. From that perspective, allegations of misuse were framed as misunderstandings of how modern public-private ecosystems operate. The strength of this argument depends on trust in process, which is precisely what was under scrutiny. Greg Abbott's role was deliberately different, and his rhetorical strategy leaned on contrast rather than complexity. He spoke in numbers, migration counts, job figures, and tax bases, presenting himself as an empiricist in a room full of theorists. To his supporters, this approach cut through abstraction and exposed consequences. To his critics, it ignored historical inequities and treated human welfare as a secondary consideration. The clash between these styles was not accidental, because American politics increasingly stages disputes as conflicts between morality and math. As the questioning unfolded, the focus narrowed from broad economic trends to specific administrative actions. Federal funds, once abstractly associated with relief and equity, became concrete entries on ledgers and screens. The allegation was not that redistribution itself is illegitimate, but that the pathways chosen obscured accountability. When money passes through layers of intermediaries, each layer dilutes responsibility while preserving plausible deniability. That structural reality is not unique to any ideology, which is why it is both common and corrosive. Bondi's presentation emphasized patterns rather than isolated incidents. Patterns are persuasive because they suggest design rather than accident. even when intent remains contested. Transfers that repeat, routes that mirror each other, and approvals that cluster create a narrative of deliberateness. The defense countered that repetition is also a feature of standardized systems and that similarity does not equal conspiracy. This tension illustrates a central problem of oversight, distinguishing between efficiency and evasion. The mayor's response leaned heavily on reframing, shifting attention from mechanics to purpose. If the goal was empowerment, he argued, then supporting organizations that engage politically was part of building sustainable influence for marginalized groups. From that perspective, separating social aid from political engagement is artificial, because policy outcomes depend on political power. Critics responded that this logic collapses a crucial boundary between public service and self-preservation. When the same network that distributes aid also benefits electorally, skepticism becomes inevitable. Governor Hochul reinforced this defense by situating the transfers within a broader landscape of government incentives. She pointed to tax abatements, development subsidies, and corporate credits as examples of public resources flowing toward private actors under different labels. If those practices are accepted, she asked, why is support for nonprofit infrastructure treated as suspect? The argument highlights an uncomfortable truth. Governments routinely influence markets and behavior through financial levers. The difference, critics insist, lies in transparency and beneficiary alignment. Abbott's counter-argument drew a sharp line between incentives that are public and transactions that are opaque. He emphasized that tax policies are debated, codified, and visible, even when controversial. By contrast, routing relief funds through multiple entities obscures the final destination from both voters and oversight bodies. This distinction matters because democracy depends not only on outcomes, but on consent, informed by understanding. If citizens cannot trace how funds are used, consent becomes symbolic rather than substantive. As the hearing progressed, the atmosphere shifted from adversarial to volatile. Interruptions increased, voices tightened, and the room began to feel less like a forum and more like a pressure chamber. This escalation was not merely emotional, but strategic, as each side sensed the narrative slipping or solidifying. Political survival often depends on momentum, and momentum in such settings can turn on a single revelation. That moment arrived when previously unseen material entered the discussion. The appearance of additional documentation reframed the entire exchange. Suddenly, the debate was no longer hypothetical, but anchored to internal communications that suggested foresight rather than improvisation. The notion that economic contraction might be tolerated or even leveraged as part of a longer-term strategy introduced a new moral dimension. If leaders anticipated harm as a tool rather than a side effect, the ethical calculus changes significantly. This possibility forced even sympathetic observers to reconsider the narrative of unintended consequences. The email described in the hearing was interpreted differently by each side. Supporters of the administration characterized it as exploratory, a thought exercise in navigating entrenched financial power. Critics saw it as evidence of intentional destabilization designed to justify expanded control. Both readings rely on assumptions about how seriously internal discussions translate into action. In governance, the line between brainstorming and implementation is often blurred, but accountability demands clarity. The reaction within the room underscored how fragile political legitimacy can be. Composure gave way to calculation as participants assessed not only the evidence, but its reception beyond the chamber. Public trust, once shaken, is difficult to restore, because it is built incrementally and lost suddenly. The suspension announcement that followed was procedural, yet it carried symbolic weight far beyond its immediate legal implications. It signaled that narrative control had shifted, at least temporarily, from the architects of policy to its auditors. Outside the hearing, interpretation splintered along predictable lines. Some viewed the events as a necessary correction to unchecked ideological governance. Others saw them as an opportunistic attack designed to chill reform and entrench existing power structures. The polarization of response illustrates how evidence rarely settles debates when values diverge sharply. Instead, evidence becomes ammunition, selected and emphasized to reinforce identity. What makes this episode significant is not simply who prevailed in the room, but what it reveals about modern governance. Cities like New York operate at a scale where moral ambition collides with economic constraint. Promises made in campaign speeches must eventually reconcile with balance sheets, migration data, and service delivery. When they do not, leaders face a choice between adaptation and rationalization. The story suggests that rationalization, when cloaked in virtue, can persist longer than adaptation, but at higher cost. The broader implication extends beyond any single city or party. Federal systems rely on competition and experimentation, but they also require guardrails to prevent abuse. When ideological certainty overrides procedural humility, the risk of error increases. This does not mean that transformative policy is inherently dangerous, only that it demands rigorous self-scrutiny. Absent that scrutiny, even well-intentioned programs can erode the trust they seek to build. The emergence of an anonymous source, portrayed as the whisper, adds another layer of complexity. Whistleblowers have historically played a dual role in democratic systems, exposing wrongdoing while raising questions about motive and verification. Their contributions can catalyze accountability, but they also challenge institutions to validate claims without relying solely on anonymity. In this narrative, the source functions less as a hero than as a catalyst, forcing information into the open. The responsibility then shifts to institutions to assess that information with discipline rather than spectacle. As attention turns toward Washington itself, the story widens from a local crisis to a systemic question. If similar patterns exist elsewhere, the issue is not ideological capture, but structural vulnerability. Complex funding mechanisms, layered oversight, and political incentives create opportunities for misuse across the spectrum. Addressing that reality requires reforms that are unglamorous but essential, such as clearer reporting standards and stricter separation of functions. Without such reforms, cycles of exposure and outrage will repeat without resolution. Throughout the confrontation, one theme recurs with striking consistency: the tension between intention and impact. Leaders articulate intentions grounded in justice, growth, or protection, yet the impact experienced by citizens often diverges. Bridging that gap is the central challenge of public administration. It cannot be solved by rhetoric alone, nor by data stripped of context. It requires a willingness to revise policy in response to evidence, even when that revision complicates ideological narratives. The narrative also highlights the performative aspect of modern politics. Every participant understood that their words would be edited, shared, and interpreted in fragments. This reality incentivizes clarity but also exaggeration, because nuance does not travel as far as conflict. In such an environment, the temptation to frame opponents as villains is strong. Resisting that temptation is difficult but necessary if analysis is to replace outrage. What remains after the hearing is not a verdict, but a set of unresolved questions. Can cities pursue aggressive redistribution without undermining the economic base that funds public goods? Can incentives be structured transparently enough to maintain trust while still shaping outcomes? Can oversight be rigorous without becoming partisan theater? These questions do not yield to easy answers, which is why they recur across decades and administrations. The New York case serves as a lens through which broader anxieties about governance are magnified. It forces observers to confront the possibility that moral certainty can coexist with strategic miscalculation. It also challenges critics to acknowledge that growth alone does not guarantee equity. The truth likely resides in an uncomfortable middle ground where trade-offs are real and unavoidable. Recognizing that reality is less satisfying than choosing sides, but it is more productive. In the end, the hearing's significance lies in its reminder that democratic systems depend on trust anchored in transparency. When citizens believe that leaders speak honestly about costs and benefits, they are more willing to endure disruption. When they suspect that disruption is disguised or instrumentalized, cynicism replaces cooperation. Rebuilding that trust requires more than clearing individual names. It requires revisiting the structures that allowed doubt to flourish. Only then can policy debates return to substance rather than spectacle. The story pauses here not because it is resolved, but because it has reached a moment of reckoning. What follows will determine whether the exposure leads to reform or merely reshuffles narratives. The actors involved will continue to argue, defend, and reinterpret events in ways that serve their constituencies. Meanwhile, residents and observers will watch for tangible changes rather than words. In that watching lies the real judgment, quieter than hearings but more enduring. As the immediate shock of the hearing began to settle, attention shifted from the spectacle of confrontation to the slower, more consequential process that follows exposure. Investigations do not move at the speed of television, and accountability rarely arrives in a single dramatic stroke. Instead, it unfolds through audits, subpoenas, interviews, and quiet negotiations that rarely trend online. For many citizens, this delay feels unsatisfying, yet it is precisely this procedural drag that separates institutions from mobs. The danger lies not in scrutiny itself, but in the erosion of patience when outcomes are not instant. Behind the scenes, political actors recalibrated their positions with the efficiency of seasoned operators. Allies distanced themselves without disowning principles, while opponents sharpened critiques without committing to specifics. Statements were drafted to sound resolute yet flexible, condemning any misuse of funds without conceding intent. This choreography revealed a familiar truth. Modern politics is less about conviction than survivability. The public often interprets this as cynicism, but insiders recognize it as adaptation to uncertainty. For New York, the implications extended beyond individual careers to the city's narrative about itself. For decades, it had marketed resilience as an identity, a belief that it could absorb shocks and reinvent endlessly. That belief was not unfounded, as history offered examples of recovery after fiscal crises and social upheaval. Yet resilience is not immunity, and reinvention requires honest diagnosis before imagination. The risk now was that defensiveness would replace diagnosis, locking the city into a cycle of self-justification. Economic confidence is notoriously sensitive to perception. Investors, employers, and skilled workers respond not only to current conditions, but to expectations about governance. When leadership appears dismissive of negative feedback, it amplifies uncertainty rather than resolve. This does not mean that leaders must capitulate to every criticism, but it does require acknowledging trade-offs openly. Transparency, even when uncomfortable, stabilizes expectations in a way denial never can. The migration narrative continued to evolve as data accumulated. Some analysts noted that remote work and demographic shifts played roles independent of local policy. Others emphasized that cities across the country faced similar challenges, albeit with different trajectories. These perspectives complicated the idea of a singular cause, suggesting a convergence of pressures rather than a single lever. However, complexity does not absolve leadership of responsibility for how it responds to pressure. In Texas, the influx of firms and residents was celebrated publicly but managed cautiously behind closed doors. Rapid growth strains infrastructure, housing, and public services, creating challenges of its own. State leaders understood that attracting capital is only the first step, and sustaining livability requires investment. This acknowledgement undercut simplistic portrayals of Texas as merely opportunistic, revealing its own balancing act. Competition between states, while beneficial in theory, demands competence on all sides to avoid a race toward dysfunction. The contrast between public messaging and private concern became increasingly apparent. Leaders spoke confidently about future prosperity, even as internal discussions revealed anxiety about revenue stability. Budget projections were revised, contingency plans drafted, and assumptions quietly adjusted. Such internal recalibration is not inherently dishonest, but it becomes problematic when it diverges too sharply from public assurances. Citizens sense this gap intuitively, even when they lack access to documents. Media coverage further polarized interpretations, favoring drama over deliberation. Short clips amplified conflict, while longer explanations struggled to find airtime. Viewers encountered simplified villains and heroes, reinforcing pre-existing beliefs. This environment made it harder for nuanced analysis to gain traction, despite its necessity. The incentive structure of attention rewarded certainty over curiosity. Within policy circles, the conversation began to shift toward structural reform. Questions arose about whether federal funding mechanisms encouraged opacity by design. Layered compliance requirements, intended to prevent misuse, sometimes incentivized complexity that obscured accountability. Reform proposals focused on streamlining reporting, clarifying permissible uses, and strengthening independent audits. These ideas lacked the emotional punch of scandal, but addressed the underlying vulnerabilities exposed by it. The role of nonprofit organizations also came under renewed scrutiny. Nonprofits occupy a unique space between public mission and private governance, making oversight inherently challenging. Many perform essential work with integrity, yet the sector's diversity creates opportunities for misuse. Distinguishing legitimate advocacy from self-serving activity requires criteria that are both precise and enforceable. Absent such criteria, suspicion can unfairly taint organizations that operate transparently. Political campaigns, too, were implicated in the broader conversation. Campaign finance law is notoriously complex, reflecting decades of incremental compromise. That complexity creates loopholes exploited by actors across the spectrum, undermining public confidence. Calls for reform resurfaced, emphasizing simplicity and disclosure as antidotes to cynicism. Whether such calls would translate into legislation remained uncertain, given entrenched interests. At the human level, residents of New York continued to navigate daily realities largely unchanged by hearings. Rents remained high, commutes long, and opportunities unevenly distributed. For those who stayed, loyalty to the city mixed with frustration at leadership. For those who left, relief mingled with nostalgia and guilt. These personal experiences rarely fit neatly into political narratives. Yet, they constitute the city's true pulse. The story also illuminated the psychological dimension of governance. Leaders invested in a moral framework may resist evidence that contradicts it, interpreting critique as hostility. This defensiveness can calcify policy, preventing course correction. Conversely, leaders focused solely on metrics may undervalue intangible social benefits, breeding resentment. Effective governance requires integrating both perspectives without letting either dominate unchecked. As investigations expanded, the specter of precedent loomed large. If New York's actions were scrutinized aggressively, other jurisdictions anticipated similar attention. This prospect unsettled officials accustomed to operating within accepted gray zones. Some welcomed the scrutiny as overdue, while others feared selective enforcement. The legitimacy of oversight depends on consistency, a challenge in a polarized climate. The narrative's power derived not from certainty, but from ambiguity. Evidence suggested intentionality, yet intent is difficult to prove conclusively. Policies produced harm, yet harm alone does not establish malice. This ambiguity forced observers to confront uncomfortable questions about accountability thresholds. How much foresight transforms a risk into a choice, and when does a choice become culpable? Throughout, the theme of trust resurfaced repeatedly. Trust in institutions, trust in leaders, trust in systems that mediate between ideals and outcomes. Once fractured, trust demands sustained effort to rebuild. Symbolic gestures may signal contrition, but structural change sustains belief. Without it, skepticism hardens into disengagement. As the main body draws toward its transition, the story stands at an inflection point. The exposure has occurred, narratives have clashed, and preliminary consequences have followed. Yet the ultimate resolution remains unwritten, contingent on processes that extend beyond any single hearing. What is clear is that the events have forced a reckoning with assumptions long taken for granted. Whether that reckoning yields reform or retrenchment will shape not only New York's future, but the broader national conversation. With the groundwork laid and the conflicts fully surfaced, the focus now turns to what comes next. The conclusion must grapple with implications rather than accusations, and with lessons rather than verdicts. It is there that the story shifts from analysis to reflection, from exposure to responsibility. The question is no longer who won the hearing, but what the country learns from it. That transition marks the end of examination and the beginning of judgment. What remains after the hearings, the documents, and the competing narratives is not a single moral verdict, but a clearer picture of how fragile modern governance becomes when ideals outrun mechanisms. The story does not resolve into heroes and villains because real political systems rarely do, and insisting otherwise only deepens division. Instead, it leaves behind a record of choices, incentives, and consequences that demand interpretation rather than applause. For New York, the episode forces a reckoning with the limits of moral framing when economic feedback turns negative. For the country, it serves as a reminder that accountability is not an attack on values, but a test of whether those values can survive contact with reality. The central lesson is not that redistribution is wrong or that growth is inherently virtuous. It is that any policy, no matter how noble its intent, must be evaluated by how transparently it operates and how honestly it confronts its outcomes. When leaders speak in absolutes, they often stop listening for warning signs that could prevent deeper harm. That dynamic is not unique to one ideology or one party, which is why focusing solely on personalities misses the point. The real issue lies in structures that reward narrative control over course correction. Trust emerges as the most valuable currency in this story precisely because it is the easiest to squander. Citizens are willing to endure hardship when they believe it is shared, temporary, and openly acknowledged. They are far less forgiving when they suspect that hardship is being rationalized or instrumentalized. The erosion of trust does not announce itself loudly. It accumulates quietly through small inconsistencies between words and actions. By the time it becomes visible, rebuilding it requires far more than messaging. The hearings illustrate how oversight functions best when it is procedural rather than performative. Evidence matters, but so does the discipline with which it is presented and evaluated. When oversight becomes indistinguishable from spectacle, it risks reinforcing cynicism instead of restoring confidence. Conversely, when leaders treat scrutiny as illegitimate by default, they signal insecurity rather than strength. Democratic resilience depends on the capacity to absorb criticism without collapsing into defensiveness. Another takeaway is the danger of treating economic pain as an acceptable abstraction. Disruption can be part of reform, but disruption without a credible path to recovery becomes cruelty by neglect. Cities are not laboratories detached from human cost. They are lived spaces where policy choices ripple unevenly. When planners and politicians distance themselves from those ripples, they lose the moral authority they claim. Compassion that does not track consequences eventually undermines itself. The contrast between New York and Texas, so prominent in the narrative, ultimately reveals more similarity than difference. Both models rely on selective incentives, public-private partnerships, and political calculation. The divergence lies less in whether governments shape markets than in how openly they do so. Transparency does not guarantee fairness, but opacity almost guarantees suspicion. In that sense, the debate is less about left versus right than about visible rules versus hidden pathways. The emergence of whistleblowers and anonymous sources underscores a broader institutional weakness. When formal channels fail to inspire confidence, information leaks become substitutes for reform. While such leaks can illuminate, they also destabilize because they bypass deliberative processes. Strengthening institutions means reducing the need for such interventions by making accountability routine rather than reactive. That goal requires patience, restraint, and a willingness to prioritize boring fixes over dramatic gestures. For policymakers watching this unfold, the warning is clear. Ideology can guide vision, but it cannot replace verification. Narratives can mobilize support, but they cannot sustain systems indefinitely. When evidence contradicts intention, leadership is measured by responsiveness, not by rhetorical agility. Failure to adapt transforms ambition into liability. For citizens, the episode invites a more demanding form of engagement. Skepticism need not harden into cynicism, and criticism need not devolve into contempt. The challenge is to insist on clarity without retreating into tribal certainty. Democracy depends on a public willing to ask how policies work, not just what they promise. That work is slower and less gratifying than outrage, but it is more durable. As the story closes, no final judgment is rendered on the individuals involved. Investigations may continue, outcomes may shift, and interpretations will evolve. What endures is the lesson that governance cannot be sustained on moral certainty alone. It requires humility before data, openness to revision, and respect for the trust placed in public office. Without those qualities, even the most eloquent visions risk collapsing under their own weight. In the end, the true reckoning is not confined to a single city or hearing room. It asks whether the political system can reconcile ideals with accountability in an age of polarization, whether leaders can admit error without surrendering purpose, whether citizens can demand better without abandoning faith in collective solutions. The answers to those questions will shape not only the future of New York, but the credibility of governance itself.